James White Fort has been a popular tourist destination and a Knoxville landmark for decades, but less well known is the fact that the oldest part of the fort, the log cabin that James White, founder of Knoxville, built in 1786, has been moved twice in its long lifetime. Here's the story. James White was born in 1747 in the town of Salisbury in Rowan County, North Carolina. He served as a captain in his county's militia during the Revolutionary War, and for his service he was entitled to land grants from the state of North Carolina. As North Carolina still included the lands west to the Mississippi River at that time, many grant recipients claimed their land in what is now the state of Tennessee. After an initial trip into Tennessee in 1783 to scout and survey the area, White went back home to North Carolina and prepared to head west for good. In 1785, he moved his family to what is now Knox County, Tennessee, and settled on the north bank of the French Broad River at the present Riverdale area. They didn't stay there very long. A 1913 newspaper article states that this is a part of the land which was obtained from the Indians by treaty by John Sevier after his victory over them at Cosby Creek. After the state of Franklin perished, North Carolina ignored that treaty and yielded their original title back to the Indians. This forced White to abandon his improvements, and he moved down the river on the road to Southwest Point, now Kingston, to what is known as the Hardin Place, some 8 miles west of Knoxville. This was thought to be too near the Indians for safety, so he retraced his steps to First Creek, where he entered 5,000 acres of land, and built a house called White's Fort. This 1786 settlement, just a few miles downriver from the confluence of the Holston and French Broad Rivers, on a hill between two creeks, was the origin of the city of Knoxville. James White built a large log cabin home in that location, and he and his family lived there for about 14 years, witnessing and participating in the growth of the town around them. The stream on the east side of the cabin became known as White's Creek, later to be called First Creek, and White built a mill for grinding corn there the year they arrived. White's cabin was located at the present-day location of Knoxville's State Street Garage, an area bounded by Union Avenue, Central Street, Clinch Avenue, and State Street. His mill was located nearby in an area that is now covered up by the James White Parkway. First Creek used to flow north to south through there. An 1890 map published by the Sanborn Map Company shows the Trio Mill in roughly the same place as White's Mill a century earlier. It was across what was Crozier Street and is now Central Street, on the east side of White's cabin. Around the same time that White built his cabin, he also built what became known as James White's Fort. An 1899 newspaper article states that his historic fort was built on the site occupied now by the Palace Hotel and Hampton-Sydney School. This fort became the rendezvous for immigrants, scouts, and adventurers. Around 1800, James White and his family moved to what is now the Riverside area, east of downtown and near the present-day intersection of Riverside Drive and Lawrence Avenue. White lived there the rest of his life and died on August 14, 1821. It's uncertain who owned the land and the cabin immediately after James White left. However, the next known owner was James Kennedy Sr. Not much is known about this particular James Kennedy, least of all when and how he came to take possession of the James White property. It seems he was born in 1764 in Pennsylvania and lived in Knoxville for many years. Yet there's no record of him purchasing the place in the Knox County deed indexes. Nevertheless, he lived in the log cabin for many years before relocating to McMinn County, Tennessee, where he died on October 7, 1825. After his death, his son, James Kennedy Jr., inherited the land and the cabin. James Jr. married Jane Holt Cox in 1828, and they lived in the cabin and on the land together for a decade. In 1838, James Kennedy Jr. died. His widow, Jane Kennedy, inherited the cabin and land and continued to live there for the rest of her life, another 58 years. The location became known as the Jane Kennedy Homestead, or the Kennedy property. In 1922, James and Jane's daughter-in-law, Melissa Kennedy, was interviewed about the old home for a newspaper article. The article stated that she had many unique remembrances of the old home as she entered it when she became the bride of William Kennedy, the son of James and Jane. Mrs. Kennedy said that the property was in the hands of the Kennedys some 100 years and that the old log house was the home of many early Kennedys. She said that she could remember the sliding windows both upstairs and down, for the house was a 2-story affair with 2 rooms on each floor. She also remembers the portholes at the windows and along the sidewalls to guard against a flank attack by the Savages. During the time Jane Kennedy lived there, a larger addition was constructed, creating a new front to the house, while the log cabin became the back L portion of the house. A 1922 newspaper article stated that the old Kennedy log cabin was built to, and a large brick front erected, which gave the building quite an imposing appearance. The logs were covered up with siding, too. Jane Holt Kennedy died on January 16, 1896. She had 2 surviving children from her marriage to James, still alive at that time, William Kennedy and Elizabeth Kennedy Van Uxum, who had married Frederick W. Van Uxum. William and Elizabeth inherited the cabin, the addition, and the land in a 50-50 split. Even though the 2 siblings owned the property equally, Elizabeth had left Tennessee and lived in Philadelphia, while William actually lived on the property for a short time longer. On January 15, 1898, William Kennedy sold his 1/2 interest in the cabin and property to his nephew, Elizabeth's son, Louis C. Van Uxum. A 1907 newspaper obituary says that afterwards, Kennedy owned a valuable farm near the West Knoxville community of Ebenezer and lived there many years. However, William Kennedy must have split his time between the farm and the city. The 1900 census shows William Kennedy still on the downtown property with his wife Melissa and their daughter Elizabeth. The 1900 Knoxville City Directory shows Kennedy's address as 117 Clinch Avenue. He was a real estate agent working out of an office at 212.5 Clinch Avenue, near where the Tennessee Theater ticket office stands today. William Kennedy died on November 13, 1907, inside Kuhlman's drugstore on Clinch Avenue, not far from the old Kennedy place. At the time of his death, he had been living at the Richelieu Apartments near the northeast corner of Clinch Avenue and Walnut Street in downtown Knoxville. His sister Elizabeth Kennedy Van Uxum had died before him in Philadelphia on October 31, 1901. After that, because her son Louis also lived in Philadelphia and rarely had any dealings with Knoxville, he decided to sell the property, including the cabin. But he ended up dying about 2 years after his mother on December 21, 1903, before he ever got around to selling it. Nearly 2 years after Louis Van Uxum's death, on November 15, 1905, the executors of his will finally sold the Jane Kennedy homestead, including the James White cabin, to Joseph Naffel and William H. Gass. Gass was the mayor of Knoxville at the time of this transaction, and Naffel was a photographer who operated a portrait studio in Knoxville with his brother Charles Naffel. In 1906, William Gass and Joseph Naffel sold the James White cabin to Isaiah Ford. No deed was recorded for this transaction since he only bought the structure and not the land. Ford took the cabin's logs and transported them to his property on Woodlawn Pike in South Knoxville. He rebuilt the cabin there and turned it into a private home. It would remain there for more than 6 decades. Gass and Naffel would retain the land in downtown Knoxville itself, and over the next few years, they sold off parts to various buyers who developed the property. According to a 1922 newspaper article, the newer, larger front portion of the home was torn down in 1907. By 1917, the former Kennedy property boasted a new road, Charles Street, named in the memory of Joseph Naffel's brother Charles Naffel, who died in 1904, 9 houses, 1 shanty, an Elks Club home, a parking garage for up to 150 cars, a mill and mine supplier, an overall manufacturing company, a laundry service, a tin work and printing shop, and a fruit stand. Getting back to the cabin, which Isaiah Ford had moved to Woodlawn Pike in South Knoxville in 1906, Ford only owned the cabin for 4 years, selling it in 1910 when he and his family moved to Corpus Christi, Texas. Over the next 49 years, 6 different owners lived in the cabin, starting with a man named Jack Adcock. He bought the cabin from Ford at auction and owned it for about 10 years. Next, he sold the cabin in 1920 to Annie R. Dunlap, who lived there for about 23 years. J. Lacey Basham was the next owner, buying the property in 1943, but selling it the same year to M.L. and Roxy B. Black. They owned it from 1943 to 1953. Ben and Mary Gaston bought it from the Blacks in 1953, but only owned it for about a year. In 1954, the Gastons sold it to Ralph and Helen Corliss, who were the last private owners of the James White cabin. Around this time, there was talk of moving the cabin back to downtown Knoxville as part of a historical display featuring a recreation of the James White Fort and including the cabin. In March 1959, the owners of the James White cabin, Ralph and Helen Corliss, offered to the City Association of Women's Clubs a 3-month option to buy the house. The association took that option and held a fundraising campaign to buy and restore it. However, the campaign came up short of raising all the needed funds. On July 23, 1959, the trustees of the City Association of Women's Clubs met at the S&W cafeteria and offered a resolution. They would be authorized to borrow the remaining amount from the Bank of Knoxville. The rest of the association agreed, and with that, they were able to complete the purchase of the James White cabin from the Corlisses. The plan was to move the cabin back to downtown Knoxville. In order to coordinate and manage this project, the James White Fort Association was formed at this time. The next step was to locate a piece of land near downtown Knoxville to be the new home for the cabin and its associated structures in the rebuilt fort. The full process took the better part of a decade, and the introduction of congressional bills to authorize the funds needed to procure and prepare the site. Finally, in March of 1969, the process of taking the cabin apart began in preparation for moving the logs to their new home at the recreated James White Fort on East Hill Avenue in what was called the Mountain View Urban Renewal Area. The James White Fort Association also purchased several additional log houses and used their logs and chimney stones to construct the other buildings at the restored fort. In July 1969, a crew began constructing the rest of the fort buildings, and the cabin itself was later moved to the new site. Isaiah Ford had numbered each log in the cabin when he moved it to South Knoxville in 1906, and it was reassembled in its new home according to that numerical plan. Several people donated pioneer tools and dishware, furniture, and household ironware to furnish the place. A blacksmith shop and smokehouse were added. And 2 new features were included that James White never had the opportunity to enjoy: indoor plumbing and electric lighting. The newly reconstructed James White Fort opened to the public on November 1, 1970, and was an instant hit. More than 2,000 people signed the fort's guest register that day, and thousands more have continued to visit this piece of early Knoxville history for more than 50 years.